Sanbanu. If you've been following the development of the Hounds of Harujin, you'll probably have noticed that the story is vast. We're dealing with the total conquest of the globe, the politics of dynastic succession, a troublesome shamanic prophecy, dozens of characters, and cultural and historical details of Mongolian history. You may have also noticed that the title sometimes changes. Most of the time I refer to the piece of writing as the Hounds of Harujin, but occasionally I'll use the name the Mongolian Book of the Sky. I'm here today to explain exactly what that is. I throw around titles like The Conquest of QONGQOR CAINE, One Night in KHULAN, The Hounds of Harujin, The Dark Fox. Where does the Mongolian Book of the Sky fit into this? How does it relate to, or how does it differ from, the Hounds of Harujin? I'm discussing here a fictional universe, the Haruverse, if you will. In 2002, a child was born in rural Mongolia that would change the face of history forever. His name was Harujin. The Mongolian Book of the Sky is the umbrella under which all this falls. The basic premise is this: Genghis Khan versus the modern world. Picture that for a second. Frank McLynn, in his book Genghis Khan, the Man Who Conquered the World, says that the definitive event of the year 1215 was not the signing of the Magna Carta, but rather the annihilation of Beijing by Genghis Khan. This was the toppling of perhaps the grandest civilization history had ever known up to that point, and it ended with an abject butchery, the extent of which strains the imagination. There was tactical starvation and cannibalism. Genghis used captured prisoners of war in his vanguard, storming the walls and absorbing the arrows of their brethren. 60,000 virgins were said to have thrown themselves from the walls to avoid rape. And the streets, even a year later, were slippery with human fat. Imagine that abject barbarism unleashed upon the modern world. A more detailed premise is this. In 209 BCE, Motun assassinated his wife and father to take control of the Xiongnu nation, an empire he would bring to its maximum extent, almost as large in size as the empire of Alexander the Great. The Xiongnu pillaged, raided, and terrorized the most powerful nation on earth, China. They were the reason the Great Wall was built. In 447, Attila the Hun mobilized his riders to make haste for Constantinople, which now stood exposed following an earthquake. He devastated the Balkans, eradicating more than 100 cities, butchering the priests, destroying monasteries, raping virgins. In the coming years, it was he, not his enemies in Rome or Constantinople, who came up with the name Flagellum Dei, the Scourge of God. In 1221, Genghis Khan exacted vengeance on the city of Nishapur in modern Iran, after his son-in-law Togachar died there. Togachar's widow, Genghis's fourth daughter Tumalun, the princess of the state of Yun, was an active participant in the city's destruction. It was she that ordered the city's burning. The population was eradicated, even the cats and the dogs were killed. Tumalun watched, as theater, the deaths of 1.747 million people. In 1401, Tamerlane annihilated the city of Baghdad, demanding one, some sources say two, human heads from each of his soldiers. There weren't enough heads to go around, so a black market of human heads emerged, his own camp followers filling the demand. 120 towers of skulls were erected as the city burned, while Tamerlane, the man who would be responsible for the deaths of 5% of the Earth's population, prayed calmly in a local mosque. In 2037, the European Parliament voted unanimously to surrender to the Mongol menace at their gates. The Mongol Khan, Harujin, rejected their conditions and became incensed that the European Parliamentary President Stefan Mathieu Grimaldi did not offer his daughter, the princess, to the Khan's harem. With what Harujin had taken from the then-demolished Russia, he annihilated London, Paris, and The Hague with nuclear flames. Steppe hegemony, the clash of nomadism and sedentary civilization, easily ranks alongside communism, fascism, and religion in terms of its death toll. The Mongolian Book of the Sky series tells the tale of the next great Mongolian conqueror, Harujin, as he and his heirs put the world to the sword. Simply put, The Hounds of Harujin kickstarts a series. It does have an ending, I won't spoil anything, but thematically it does come full circle. I say what I want to say. However, the story can go on, and it was always envisioned that there would be a book 2. The story of a barbarian conquering the shattered modern world and plunging us back into the Dark Ages, while his heirs struggle to understand dire shamanic forewarnings of doom to come, is simply too big to be covered in a single book. Book 2, which I have not begun writing yet, and which will probably take me many years because of the projected length of it, is tentatively named The Destiny of the Damned. For the longest time, I resisted thinking of this as a series, because, frankly, The Hounds of Harujin is by itself the single largest project I've ever tackled, and it became simply too daunting to think of it more expansively. It is only now, as I continue to edit Hounds, that I can begin to glimpse destiny, and even still, that notion still leaves me with a certain dread. But as I finished the Hounds of Harujin and moved on to the shorter standalones, it became imperative for me to start thinking of it in terms of a much wider universe. When I talk about stories like The Conquest of QONQQOR CAINE and One Night in KHULAN, these are spin-off novellas within the same extended universe. They follow more minor characters, or fill in the history of certain things, or extrapolate certain ideas that I've touched upon briefly in the main series. So, for example, Kellan Kirkland is one of the main protagonists of the Hounds of Harujin. He is living in a small little holdout community around Lake Darlot, north of Leinster in Western Australia, on a property that began basically as a refugee camp and now serves as a sort of orphanage, with municipal money coming in from Leinster itself, and he and the other administrators out there are held in high regard as pillars of the community. That's the day job, but by night, they're vigilante assassins. Or at least a select few of the adults out there are. One among their number is 24-year-old Josephine, who plays a fairly minor role in Hounds, but is something of a legend because of her backless dress unarmed hit in New Zealand, the farthest any of them has ever gone for a hit. That story, which takes place 2 years prior to the novel, is recounted in The Conquest of QONGQOR CAINE. QONQQOR CAINE being her on-the-job alias. It's the story of her, a femme fatale assassin, going after Zuku, a corrupt tax collector, right under the nose of a prince's security. It's referenced a few times in Hounds, but it's not necessary to read it to follow the main novel. Likewise, one needn't be familiar with the larger extended universe to follow the events of The Conquest of QONQQOR CAINE. The second such novella is One Night in KHULAN, which was written basically to give a little clarity to something said in one of Princess Temelin's chapters in Hounds. One of the chief political opponents in the capital of KHULAN is Empress concubine Viola Spade, a woman who should not have any imperial power whatsoever, but because of her favoritism with the Khan, has herself a title and a seat on the council, and is a serious threat to both Prince Karamonka and Princess Temelin. One Night in KHULAN therefore shows her power, how she's been able to accumulate it, and how much more far-reaching it is than just the Khan's bed. Once again, it's designed as a standalone, so it can be read completely by itself. These novellas have been, and will be, recorded in audio format, and released for free both on the series website and on this YouTube channel. If you listen to one and enjoy it, I encourage you to tell a friend, to post it on your social media, and to check out the rest of the series. They are narrated by the hilarious comedian Andrew Bunton, pictured here passed out face down in a Cuban resort pool, with music composed by the talented Michael Hebbs. Once I have enough of these spin-offs, I plan on releasing them in text format in a collection, which is tentatively titled The Dark Fox and, insert number, Other Stories in the Mongolian Book of the Sky. The end of this video will feature a reading from The Dark Fox itself, which, in addition to being the working title of that collection, is also the longest and probably the most important story within that collection. When I say most important, again, it's meant to be a standalone, and one doesn't need to read it to follow the main series. However, if one is so inclined, these shorter works do fill in some backstory. So if you wanted to understand the specifics of the backless dress assassination that's referenced 2 or 3 times in Hounds, you could go back and read Conquest, but again, I don't think it's necessary. The Dark Fox is the story of Pedro Kimbers, the greatest outlaw in Australian history. He's referenced, again, once or twice in the Hounds of Harujin, and then only briefly, but he does become somewhat important within the destiny of the damned. So therefore, the Mongolian Book of the Sky becomes an umbrella term to catch everything within this universe, from the main novels themselves down to these smaller, standalone novellas, and any other future products within the universe. In the traditional Mongol shamanic religion, which blends elements of prophecy, animism, shamanic seance, ancestor worship, and fatalism, the central practice is the worship of the infinite or the eternal blue sky, Hok Tengri. Nowadays, the predominant religion in Mongolia is Buddhism. Specifically, Mongolia is one of a few places outside Tibet to embrace Vajrayana, or Tibetan Buddhism, which is much more tantric and borrows heavily from pre-Buddhist shamanic mythology, both Tibetan and Mongolian. Buddhism first came to Mongolia under Altan Khan, who made a political alliance with the Tibetans to gain their support, created the title of Dalai Lama, and had the Lama reincarnate within the Mongol royal family until conquering Chinese forces outlawed the corruption during the Qing dynasty. Under communist rule, religion was banned, and the Stalinist dictator Choibalsan mass executed approximately 30,000 dissidents, mostly Buddhists. Since the fall of the Iron Curtain, Buddhism has returned, now accounting for approximately 53% of Mongolians. The traditional shamanic religion, Tengriism, sometimes Tengrianism, has been steadily growing in popularity for the past 2 decades, making a resurgence. They now have institutes, a sort of shamanic seminary, and a budding shamanic tourism industry. Tengri is the central figure, both a god and a synonym for heaven itself, the foundation of all things and the determiner of the fate of all things. The word Tengri, sometimes Tengr, itself simply means sky. There are many strands of fatalism within Tengriism. Genghis Khan himself believed this, and went into communion with the sky spirits many times in his life to try and divine his destiny and determine significant courses of events in his life. Within the series, there is a significant exploration of predestination versus free will. One of the most mysterious figures is Ulan Kheri, or the Red Raven, a particularly devout shaman up on the Gulf of Carpentaria in northern Australia, who's made it his life's mission to divine the future and foresee calamity on the horizon. To this end, he uses young, virginal women that are particularly good receptors to the ether as mediums, their bodies bent and contorted to peer into the future. This process can break a woman, has broken women. He is rumored to be more than 150 years old. What he knows of the future could prove instrumental to the survival or the downfall of the dynasty itself. Well, I don't want to spoil too much from Hounds before its release, but I suppose I can tell you a little bit of some of the titanic historical and political figures from the universe. Let's begin with Harujin himself. This is the titular character, the man for whom the very epoch is named. Born in 2002, he's essentially a composite of historical figures such as Motun, Attila the Hun, Genghis Khan, and Tamerlane. His name is associated with the deaths of 5/7 of the world's population, and his empire extends from Greenland to Antarctica. He is known for being particularly ruthless and barbaric, having annihilated entire cities and sought his global dominance with extreme vehemence. For example, he had the Secretary General of the United Nations buried up to her neck in the sand, and then coated in honey and doused in fire ants. Harujin had 4 official, princely sons, and, in the Mongol tradition, divided the world between them. His eldest, Attila, became the Khan of Eurasia, as well as the Kagan, or Khan of Khans, of the entire Harujid dynasty. Attila was succeeded by Munakoi, a name which means vicious dog, who sits on the global throne in Ulaanbaatar. KHULAN, a name that literally means the Black Warrior, became Khan of the Americas. In 2045, Harujin himself disemboweled President Archibald Hans McAllister at the White House in what is often called history's last television broadcast. This begins the long, slow encroachment over America. The continent had already been under attack, with forces pushing westwards from the Canadian Maritime Provinces and the Caribbean, but this marks the beginning of the bulldozing of the Americas. KHULAN took the reins for much of this, and it was he that was responsible for the final Canadian-British defeat at Great Bear Lake in the Northwest Territories. In 2071, almost 3 decades later, the Americans were all but defeated, and held out only on Hawaii and a few other Pacific outposts. President Augustine Jeffreys, 15th in line for succession, died at the Battle of Hawaii, which many see as the official end of the United States. There are footnotes that follow, however, as the presidency eventually fell into the hands of Alexandria Hanover, 37th in line for the succession, former deputy governor of Wyoming. Together with Deputy Director of the CIA Nolan Lang, they plot out one last Hail Mary defense of Guam. Guam ultimately does fall, however, and I have an idea for a storyline to go back and show Lang's master plan in a novella tentatively titled In the Bed of the Enemy. Nolan Lang does make it off Guam and winds up in Australia, the last frontier. Technically, he is at this point the highest-ranking U.S. official, though he makes no move to call himself president. A brash warhawk with a deep Texas twang, he's essentially a neocon, yet he's a staunch patriot at heart, and since the U.S. succession, even at that time, doesn't facilitate a CIA deputy director ascending to the presidency, he hasn't taken it. He's ultimately present at the fall of Perth as well, along with a couple dozen other officials representing fallen nations. Currently, the Americas are in the hands of an unlikely grandson of KHULAN, Kara-Unigan, a name which literally means the Black Fox. The Black Fox is half white, born to an ostracized branch of the family with essentially no political future, and was assigned as a young man the governorship of Nevada, which is essentially a dead-end post in the desert. The Black Fox, however, broke mob corruption in Nevada, often at great personal risk to himself, gaining political favor both with the establishment and the populace. A series of political publications he had commissioned tell the story of how he broke this corruption in comic book form, wherein he tracks tainted money through the casinos of Las Vegas, while all the while drinking like a fish and hounding after women. This propaganda, strategic as it was, helped him to seize power when the Khan died, securing the throne in Montana for himself. The comic books remain popular throughout the world to this day. The third son, Baidur, took Africa, which is the most chaotic and rebellion-prone of all the Khanates, and currently has more than a dozen claimants for Khan, some of which don't even have a drop of Mongol blood in them. There are likewise a half-dozen courtesans belonging to these would-be Khans with the title of Empress Concubine, or some variant thereof. Much of the continent remains ungovernable and is in an economic downward spiral as the rest of the world refrains from proper trade due to the concerns of rebellion. The fourth son, Timur, took Australia and New Zealand, which is the main focus of this series. I've already discussed some of the history of Timur's conquests and the civil war between his sons in my Hounds of Harujin introduction video, and I don't feel the need to recount it all here. Suffice it to say that when the novel opens, Timur's second son, Chagatai, is the Khan of the Australian continent, and 3 of his 6 legitimate children are prefects governing beneath him. One of the most significant events in Timur's invasion was the fall of Perth, the last holdout city in the modern world, 18 years before the events of the Hounds of Harujin. For a time it actually looks like the city might be able to withstand the onslaught. Timur had by now passed away, and his Empress Regent had just been slain. 2 brothers, Chagatai and Iluge, are in a civil war with each other. A third brother, Bolad, has just died in Queensland, and the full might of the Australian military is gathered in Perth, recently reinforced by the remnants of the New Zealand military limping away from their final Kiwi defeat at Invercargill. As I mentioned earlier, you also have the remnants of a dozen other nations gathered there, including Nolan Lang. You have MI6, the French Foreign Legion, Russian forces, Chinese intelligence, Israeli Mossad, etc., all in a loose confederacy nominally under the control of 3 men. Australian Prime Minister Jackson Rhodes, Minister Marcellus Goodman, and Chief of the Defence Force General Carlisle Stellan. Jackson Rhodes is something of a figurehead, a former Prime Minister brought back years after his term to reinvigorate the people, yet he's almost into his 90s, is half blind, and isn't prepared to be a wartime Prime Minister during a siege. Marcellus Goodman becomes the greatest traitor in Australian history, making a secret deal with General Jahangir outside the gates. Chagatai by now has left to face his brother in open rebellion, and has left his most trustworthy general, alongside his 12-year-old son Hulagu, to finish the conquest of the continent. Goodman makes his deal, arranging his granddaughter Valerie to be wed into the royal family. She is betrothed to Prince Hulagu, and the gates are open. General Stellan, meanwhile, is remembered as the greatest of heroes, for his steadfast refusal to surrender. He ultimately dies by poisoning at the hands of Marcellus Goodman. Despite the completion of the conquest, outlaws and rogues plague the underbelly of the continent. These are men and women that have vanished from the tax registries and live off the grid, if they were even on the grid to begin with. Slavers abduct people from not-so-well-defended rural parts, and sell labor or sex to buyers even further off the grid. There is a vibrant smuggling trade moving everything from food to drugs to arms, as well as munitions dens making rudimentary bombs. Thievers and rapers live outside the urban centers and plague the empty roads in between. Indeed, bandits are everywhere. This is one of the recurring phrases that crops up everywhere from Perth to Auckland. These are the poor and the destitute, those that have fled Mongol tax collectors, or those that merely live outside the law. Outlawry is the game, and these are the individuals who thieve horses, water, food, whatever you carry. They'll often kill you just to take what you've got, and in some areas, banditry is so bad that one cannot travel from one rural town to the next without a 4-man security team. Women have it worse, the bandit stereotype seeking to impose a particular fate upon the fairer sex. The worst of them, indeed the most notorious outlaw in Australian history, is Pedro Kimbers, the bandit king of the deep desert. This one-eyed brute has an army behind him. Some say a couple dozen riders, some say thousands, out there in the most remote part of the continent. No, I'm not talking about Heard Island, I'm referring to the area around the Gibson Desert, deep in the outback. Kimbers is the subject of the novella The Dark Fox, a reading from which is featured at the end of this video. The Bandit King has been killed a number of times, however, at least in print, for he's a favorite villain to pit against Moxie Breastbind. At least in Australia, the Breastbinder is able to hold her own against the hugely popular Black Fox comics, despite the fact that these publications are technically considered seditious. On an unassuming morning in the coastal town of Jurien Bay in Western Australia, a particularly buxom young woman carried out a ghastly assassination of an infamously corrupt tax collector. At least so is witnessed by a comic book artist who calls himself Jurien John. In the comic books, Jurien John picked up this young woman at a pub, and went home with her that night, and then woke the next day as she was trying to leave without being noticed, and followed her to the execution of Mukali, the tax collector. Since then he, or people using his name to attach to their own comics, have made famous the continent over Moxie Breastbind, the suave and slick, anti-dynastic anti-heroine, a gutter-mouthed, hypersexualized piratess out there on the high seas in nothing but bikini bottoms and a breast binding, with a wisecracking parrot perched upon her shoulder retorting back all the things she's said carnally behind closed doors. One of the more interesting characters that I've enjoyed writing about is Empress concubine Viola Spade. At the opening of the novel, Chagatai is the Khan, and he's been in self-imposed seclusion in the concubine's tower for 2 years. His empress, Hujaur, the mother of his 6 children, has been forced into her own exile, this being outside the corridors of power in a private villa in Yulanboy, on the north coast. Chagatai's new favorite, the woman of his dreams, is Viola Spade from Kalgoorlie. 27 years old, Caucasian, blonde and blue-eyed, she is said to be the most beautiful woman in that quarter of the world. And for as alluring and enrapturing as she is, she's just as calculating, just as manipulative. She has cajoled the Khan, it is said, clawed her talons into him, and has draped herself in power by his decree. She sits upon the Imperial Council, one of 7 people who collectively rule the continent while the Khan is absent, occupied elsewhere. She is the only woman on the council and the only Caucasian. She is both a spur on the side of Prince Karamonka and Princess Temelin, as well as the main antagonist of the novella, One Night in KHULAN. I'm working very hard on editing right now, and I hope to have it out in late 2016. I'm just about finished rewriting the historical notes at the back, and I believe I only have 1 or 2 more chapters that need rewriting. Otherwise, it's just minor grammatical errors and items like there, who, whom, etc. In the meantime, you can check out the first 2 chapters in an exclusive preview included in the re-release of my first novel, The ZIMMER Insurgency. She had been awake for 15 days in succession. Pinching herself had long ago ceased drawing her focus, and now her entire body was pins and needles at random, unpredictable occurrences. The caffeine pills were gone, though that last half of the bottle was like useless sugar pills. Her feet had not touched the ground during these over 2 weeks. She had not left the saddle. She rode as hard as anyone can push a horse, the sand and sun in her eyes, sweat on her brow, blisters forming on the insides of her thighs. She would push a horse to its breaking point. She was pretty sure she'd crossed her own breaking point. She was irritable, furious, nauseous. She was practically paralyzed below the waist. She'd been hallucinating for 3 days, dreaming while still awake. Somewhere out there in the desert, tigers charged alongside her horse during the night. The great and serpentine Evren haunted the periphery of her vision. She had traveled halfway across the continent, across 3 time zones, with an urgent message for the Prince and Prefect of Perth. And she still had more than 750 kilometers to go. She sipped from her flagon, keeping her fluids up in the baking heat of the dry desert. Most of it went down her chin. Her tongue was languid now. When she spoke to the horses, yes, she did speak to the horses, had whole conversations with them, her speech was drunken. She wiped the water away from her face with the back of her hand, filled her mouth with some more. She had never gone this far, never been trusted with a message of such range. She would make her master proud, prove to the gods her worth. She leaned over the side of the horse and retched, spewing up everything that her stomach had and more. She took a deep breath, slapped herself in the face. 2 more days. It was only 2 more days. She blinked. Was it a mirage, or was that the next yam station ahead? She thought back. How long it had been since the last one? You can usually judge these by the length of time. Shook her head. She had no sense of time anymore. 2 more days. She leaned forward, fidgeted in her saddlebag, felt her bell, blinked again. She'd been fooled before, the desert playing tricks on her. Didn't want to ring her bell like a madwoman at nothing. This was not desert proper. Her course largely hugged the coast, with at least some green. This was considered a horse line of the yam, as opposed to a camel, but still, she'd seen her fair share of mirages. She nearly plowed her horse directly into the painted wooden sign just off the road. Swerved the animal, blinked again. This was the next yam station. She pulled at her bell, clanged it. It was now that she could see the fence. It ran outwards from the yam station stables to the west, encompassing a vast area. Most stations had a grazing pen for their horses, but it wasn't huge. This one stretched beyond what she could see, and there might only be 1, maybe 2 horses available here. But the pickings were scarce, and the horse would need a large area to feed. The station consisted of a pen, a small stable, and an office gare. A young man could be seen bolting out of the gare, past the stable. She heard the snort of a horse in the distance, saw the beast in the grazing pen, half kilometer away. Curse them to the pit! They're supposed to have these horses at the ready 24/7. Every minute that stable hand spent running after that horse was 1 more minute her dire message was kept from Prince Hulagu, and 1 more minute she had to stay awake. She clanged her bell with even more fury, as if that would do anything. A second man now, she could see, had emerged from the gare. He was older, perhaps in his 50s. He stood there, at the door of the gare, draped in a large desert cloak, though he didn't wear the hood, watching her approach. She pushed the horse harder, kicking her heels into the beast, as though pushing through that last 100 meters would speed up the recovery of her new grazing horse. She pulled back on the reins. The horse slowed, followed her prodding to the right. She looped around the gare where the older man was standing, brought the horse to a stop not 5 meters from him. "Where is my horse?" she demanded. Again, as if that would change the situation. "Most humble apologies, my lady," replied the man in accented Mongolian. It was now that she realized that he was white, blinked in her fatigue. "We have but one horse to maintain at this station, and you will understand, the maintenance of our animals is paramount." And he motioned to the other attendant still sprinting for the horse in the sparse grazing pen. "What's paramount is your mission statement. The continent moves!" Indeed, this was the case. Any message or person could range from coast to coast as freely as any network of horses or camels could get them there. 5 minutes at this station, 10 minutes there, it added up. It all added up very quickly. She was meant to leap from one saddle to the next, her new horse already in a gallop, without her feet striking the dirt nor the need to exchange even a single word with this man. The Office of the Ambassador General tests this annually. A sealed message is dispatched from the western end of the line on Christmas Island, with a date and time of its departure. The final destination, the Antipodes Islands of New Zealand, where a weather station and a naval yard are maintained, almost 900 kilometers southeast of Invercargill. The time limit, 710 hours. A ship with steady wind and a horse at max speed, on paper, should be able to do it in 707 hours and 20 minutes. Sandstorms, sea squalls, port departure times, horse resistance, lameness, banditry, and death wounds are not taken into account in the maths. "Do you," he began, but trailed off. Her horse was bucking beneath her, fighting her. It did not like the abrupt stop. She looked up to the man, glared at him. She knew what he was about to ask. No, she did not have her imperial medallion, her pass, which allowed her to have immediate access to a horse on imperial business, free of charge. Her messages preceded medallions, scrolls, papers, decrees. Imperial business would be directed because of her message, not for it. She had coin, a wad of notes to be doled out for the horses. The man did not ask it. Instead, he tentatively remarked, "You travel alone?" She was still fighting the horse, twisting and pulling on the reins. She had very little strength left in her arms. Again, she knew what she was saying, without saying it. "A girl can handle herself in the saddle," she replied, tapped the dagger at her belt. "Bandits are everywhere," he said. "Bandits are everywhere," she agreed. The implication, of course, was that one blade would do little against such vermin, especially out here. This was high outlaw country, and a young woman such as herself would be prime pickings. A man, in rural parts, needs a 4-man security team lest bandits put an arrow in him, dump his body in the ditch, and steal his horse. A woman, her fate would be a rubber arrow, right in the breastbone, and she'd be raped into ground beef and then slain and left in the ditch as they took her horse. She was not afraid. She had more protection than just this blade. He could tell. She was a virgin. A virgin. Not just a maiden, but a virgin, with a capital V. Hers was not a body that belonged to the hunger of the flesh. Hers was a body that belonged to the infinite sky, to be bent and twisted and folded upon itself until drops of the future trickled through. She was a conduit to the other side. Her wind horse was stronger than almost any other girl on the face of the continent, save only her virgin sisters. There was no other reason why a young woman should be riding alone on the Imperial Yam line near Gascoigne Junction. Not even if she was mad would she be here otherwise.